My business partner willingly stayed blind to what his wife's home birth business was really doing to the babies, so I made sure his daughter used her services. Garrett and I built Morrison Tech Solutions from nothing 8 years ago. I handled development and engineering while he managed sales and operations. We'd grown to 40 employees and $12 million in annual revenue. His wife, Lydia, ran her home birth midwife practice from their basement, which he'd renovated into a birthing center with his share of our first major contract. He talked constantly about supporting natural childbirth, about empowering women, about how hospitals traumatized mothers with unnecessary interventions. When my wife got pregnant, he insisted Lydia was the best choice, said she'd delivered over 200 babies successfully, said she had emergency training and hospital backup protocols, said we'd be in expert hands. I trusted him because we'd built a company together, because he was supposed to be my friend, because I'd been the best man at his wedding and held his daughter when she was born. That trust killed my son. 3 months after the funeral, I started seeing the pattern. A grief support group connected me with another couple who'd lost their baby during a home birth. When I asked who their midwife was, the mother started crying. Lydia's name came out between sobs. Their daughter had died from infection after Lydia insisted on vaginal delivery despite the baby being breech. Lydia told them hospitals performed unnecessary C-sections to increase billing. She'd manually tried to turn the baby for 4 hours before calling 911. The baby's neck broke during the attempt. I found 6 more families over the next 2 months. All Lydia's clients, all dead babies or catastrophic injuries. One mother bled out on Lydia's table because she'd refused to call an ambulance until the placenta delivered naturally. The woman survived but lost her uterus. Another baby suffered permanent brain damage from oxygen deprivation. Lydia had been checking her phone during the delivery, missing the distress signs until it was too late. I brought everything to Garrett at the office one morning before anyone else arrived. Laid out the documentation across his desk. Medical records I'd obtained through the families, news reports about 3 of the deaths that had made local papers, pattern analysis showing Lydia's mortality rate was 60 times the national average for midwives. He stared at the papers for 30 seconds before pushing them back toward me. "You're grieving," he said. "This isn't healthy. These things happen in childbirth. It's tragic, but natural." I asked if he'd even looked at the numbers. He said he didn't need to because Lydia was certified, experienced, and following proper protocols. I pointed to the mother who'd died from hemorrhaging. He stood up and told me to go home, take some time off, consider therapy. When I refused to leave, he said if I pursued this vendetta against his wife, he'd buy me out of the company, just like that. 8 years of partnership reduced to a threat because I'd shown him proof his wife was killing babies. I hired an investigator named Dominic who specialized in medical malpractice. He'd worked for plaintiff attorneys for 20 years before going independent. Within a week, he'd found 11 more families. Lydia's certification came from an online program that required no clinical training. Her supposed 200 successful deliveries included 23 deaths she'd never reported to any oversight body. She'd moved her practice across 3 counties, always leaving before patterns emerged to local authorities. Garrett knew because he'd helped her relocate each time. He'd set up new LLC structures, registered business names, built new websites scrubbing her history. The renovation of their basement wasn't just support for her dream, it was infrastructure for medical negligence on an industrial scale. My business partner had systematically enabled his wife's body count because her practice generated $400,000 annually in cash payments from families wanting natural births. Money they filtered through our company's books as consulting income. Dominic found the real scope buried in Garrett's personal email, which he'd accessed through our company server. Garrett had administrator privileges that included backup systems I'd designed. I pulled every message going back 6 years. He'd been coaching Lydia on how to avoid reporting requirements, which complications to hide, how to intimidate families into silence. After our son died, he'd written Lydia an email saying, "Another one gone. You need to be more careful. This is the 4th this year." Not grief, not horror, just annoyance about frequency. Another email detailed how they'd structured NDAs to prevent families from comparing experiences. The $50,000 he'd given us wasn't generosity. It was standard hush money funded by our company's operating account. My own business had paid me to stay quiet about my son's death. The rage that filled me reading those emails wasn't hot. It was cold and precise. I wanted Garrett to understand exactly what he'd done. I wanted him to feel the specific grief of losing a child because someone he trusted was too greedy to care about human life. His daughter Natalie was 23 and newly married to a finance guy named Craig. She'd gotten pregnant 6 months ago and had been posting about it constantly on social media. Wholesome photos of her growing belly, registry links for organic baby products, excited updates about choosing names. The algorithm showed me every single post because I'd been tagged in Garrett's family photos for years. I watched her pregnancy progress while planning how to destroy her father. Then she posted about choosing a midwife, about wanting a natural birth at home, about how her dad had recommended the best midwife he knew. My stomach dropped when I saw Lydia's business page, linked in the comments. Natalie was scheduled to deliver in 8 weeks. Garrett was setting up his own daughter to be another casualty in his wife's mortality statistics. I could have warned her. Should have called her immediately and explained everything. But the cold rage crystallized into something darker. If Garrett wouldn't believe the evidence about other people's children, maybe he'd believe it about his own. I started attending Natalie's prenatal appointments by hacking her scheduling app through our company's IT infrastructure. Lydia held consultations at their house every week, and I'd park 3 houses down with surveillance equipment. High-resolution audio recording every session. Video through their front window showing Lydia's examinations. I documented her telling Natalie that hospitals caused more harm than good, that C-sections were medical violence, that pain medication damaged babies' development, that women's bodies were designed for birth and modern medicine, interfered with natural processes. Natalie absorbed it all, trusting her stepmother completely. I watched Lydia check Natalie's blood pressure with an uncalibrated manual cuff, watched her estimate the baby's position by feel instead of ultrasound, watched her dismiss Natalie's complaints about decreased movement as normal 3rd trimester changes. Everything I documented matched what she'd done with my wife. The same negligent protocols, the same dismissal of warning signs, the same confidence that complications were natural rather than evidence of her incompetence. Garrett invited me to dinner 6 weeks before Natalie's due date. Tried to smooth things over, said he'd been harsh and wanted to repair our friendship. My wife refused to go, still destroyed by grief and betrayed by his payoff. I went alone to their house, where Lydia served organic chicken and talked about Natalie's upcoming birth. She was excited to deliver her stepdaughter's baby, said it would be a beautiful, full-circle moment. Garrett beamed at her, holding her hand across the table. I asked if they'd considered that Natalie might want a hospital birth. Garrett laughed and said Natalie was too smart to fall for the medical establishment's fear tactics. Lydia added that Natalie trusted her completely after seeing how successful her practice was. I asked about the families I'd found. Garrett's face went hard. He said I was harassing grieving people, implanting false memories, trying to manufacture a case that didn't exist. I asked if he'd reviewed Lydia's actual mortality statistics. He stood up and told me to leave, called me obsessed and dangerous. Said if I contacted Natalie or interfered with her birth plan, he'd file harassment charges and restraining orders. As I left, Lydia squeezed my arm and said she understood I was hurting, but that projecting my pain onto her wouldn't bring my son back. I met with 5 of the bereaved families whose babies Lydia had killed. We compiled everything into a formal complaint to the state medical board. Dominic added his investigation findings. We submitted 400 pages of documentation proving systematic negligence, fraudulent certification, and patterns of death. The board acknowledged receipt and said they'd investigate. That was 9 weeks before Natalie's due date. I called every week for updates. They said these cases took time, that they had to verify claims, that they couldn't discuss ongoing investigations. Bureaucratic language that meant nothing would happen before Natalie delivered. I contacted the county health department. They said midwives fell under a different regulatory structure. I contacted the state attorney general. They said to try the medical board. Every system designed to protect people from practitioners like Lydia was too slow to save Garrett's daughter. I could have gone to Natalie directly, could have shown her everything. But part of me wanted Garrett to stop her himself, wanted him to face the choice between his daughter's safety and his wife's practice. Wanted to see if he'd sacrifice his own child to protect Lydia's income. 3 weeks before her due date, Natalie posted that she was having complications, some spotting and cramping. She'd called Lydia, who said it was normal Braxton Hicks contractions and bloody show, told her to rest and stay hydrated. I checked Natalie's medical history through the company health insurance records. She had placenta previa diagnosed at 20 weeks. Her OB/GYN had recommended hospital delivery with surgical team on standby. Lydia had told her that diagnosis was overblown, that placentas often migrated naturally, that her body would know what to do. Placenta previa meant the placenta was covering her cervix. Vaginal delivery would cause massive hemorrhaging, the condition that had killed one of Lydia's previous clients. I had documentation of that case in my files. A mother who'd bled out in 30 minutes while Lydia insisted they could manage it naturally. Garrett knew about that case. It was in his emails coaching Lydia on how to handle the police investigation. Now his daughter had the same condition, and he was letting Lydia proceed with home delivery. I drove to Garrett's house that night and banged on the door until he answered. Told him Natalie couldn't deliver at home with placenta previa, that she'd die the same way his wife's previous client had died. He tried to close the door. I shoved my foot in the gap and held up my phone showing the medical records. Showed him the case file of the dead mother with identical complications. Showed him his own emails where he'd written about that death. His face drained of color as he read his own words. "We can't let this become a pattern," he'd written to Lydia. "If another one dies from bleeding, they'll start asking questions." I asked if he'd ever actually looked at what his wife was doing, if he'd ever calculated the odds that his daughter would survive. He grabbed the phone from my hand and threw it across the lawn. Told me I was insane. That I was so consumed by grief I couldn't see reality anymore. That Lydia had checked Natalie's placenta last week and it had moved. I asked if she'd verified with an ultrasound. He said Lydia's hands were more reliable than machines. I asked if he'd be fine watching Natalie bleed to death in his living room. He shoved me off his porch and slammed the door. I called Natalie directly the next day. Got her number from company contact lists. She answered cheerfully, recognizing my name from her dad's stories about building the company. I asked if we could meet for coffee. Said I had concerns about her birth plan that her father wouldn't hear. She went quiet. Asked what kind of concerns. I said I needed to show her in person. She agreed to meet that afternoon at a cafe near her apartment. When I arrived, Craig was with her. The protective husband stance was clear from how he sat between us. I laid out everything. The documentation on 11 families, the death certificates, the medical records showing Lydia's negligence, the emails from Garrett covering it up. Natalie's face went white as she read. Craig asked if this was real. I gave him Dominic's contact information and the complaint we'd filed with the medical board. Told them they could verify every word. Natalie started crying. Said her dad had been so excited about Lydia delivering the baby. Said Lydia had been so caring and attentive. Said she'd trusted them completely. Craig called Garrett on speaker right there in the cafe. Asked point blank if he knew Lydia's clients had died at rates far above average. Garrett's voice came through tight and angry. Said I was spreading lies, that I was harassing his pregnant daughter, that he'd already warned me about this behavior. Craig said he'd seen the medical records himself. Garrett said they were falsified, that I'd probably created them to support my delusions. Craig asked about the emails. Long silence. Then Garrett said those were taken out of context, that he'd been supporting his wife through difficult cases, but that didn't mean she was negligent. Natalie grabbed the phone and asked her dad directly if Lydia had killed babies. Another silence. Then Garrett said, complications happen in childbirth, that it wasn't Lydia's fault when nature took its course, that he thought Natalie was smarter than to fall for my manipulation. She hung up without responding. Told me she needed to talk to her OB/GYN immediately. I gave her the file on the mother who died from placenta previa. Told her to verify her placenta position with an actual ultrasound before making any decisions. Garrett called me an hour later screaming that I'd destroyed his family, that Natalie was hysterical, that Craig was threatening to cut off all contact, that I'd traumatized his pregnant daughter during the most vulnerable time in her life. I asked if he'd prefer I let her die on Lydia's table. He said she wasn't going to die because Lydia knew what she was doing. I asked how many dead babies it would take for him to admit his wife was dangerous. He said I was projecting my trauma onto innocent people, that our son's death was a tragedy, but that didn't mean Lydia was a murderer. I asked if he'd read the complaint we'd filed. He said he had, and that it was all circumstantial nonsense from grieving parents looking for someone to blame. I told him the medical board would investigate every case. He said they'd find nothing because there was nothing to find. Then he told me I was fired, effective immediately. Security would pack my office. My company access was revoked. My shares would be bought out at the minimum price allowed by our partnership agreement. He'd do anything necessary to protect his family from my obsession. I contacted a labor attorney within an hour. Our partnership agreement had provisions preventing termination without cause. My attorney said we could fight it, but that litigation would take months. Garrett had the company finances and could afford better lawyers. Meanwhile, I had no income and a wife still drowning in grief. The attorney suggested I take the buyout and walk away, rebuild somewhere else. I asked what that would cost. He said around $50,000 in legal fees just to start. The exact amount Garrett had paid me to stay quiet about my son's death. Everything came full circle to that blood money. I told the attorney to draft a counteroffer. I'd accept the buyout if Garrett paid double the partnership agreement minimum and funded the medical board investigation. I wanted $2 million for my shares and $100,000 donated directly to hiring expert witnesses who could review Lydia's cases. Otherwise, I'd tie up the company in litigation and make sure every client knew about his role covering up his wife's negligence. The attorney said that was extortion. I said it was negotiation. Natalie called me before Garrett responded. Her OB/GYN had done an emergency ultrasound. The placenta was still completely covering her cervix. If she'd attempted vaginal delivery, she would have hemorrhaged catastrophically. The OB scheduled a C-section for the following week at the hospital with a full surgical team. Natalie was crying on the phone, said she couldn't believe her dad had known about the risk and let her stay with Lydia anyway. Said she'd confronted him and he'd admitted he knew about the previous deaths, but insisted they were unrelated to Lydia's care. Said he'd begged her not to involve lawyers because it would destroy their family. She'd told him the family was already destroyed because he'd chosen Lydia's business over his daughter's life. Craig had called a family attorney about filing elder abuse charges for reckless endangerment. They were also considering suing Lydia for negligence, even though no harm had occurred yet. The threat alone might force accountability. I told Natalie about my buyout demand. She said her dad deserved worse than that. Said she'd testify to the medical board about everything Lydia had told her during prenatal care. Garrett accepted my terms 3 days later. His attorney delivered the settlement agreement with a clause requiring I never contact Natalie again and never discuss Lydia's practice publicly. I refused to sign until they removed those restrictions, told them I'd gladly go to court if he wanted to make this public. Garrett revised it. I got my $2 million, and he established a $100,000 fund for the medical board investigation. The money came through within a week. He cleaned out my office personally, packing my belongings into boxes he left in the parking lot. Our employees whispered about the sudden split. Rumors spread about personal conflicts and irreconcilable differences. Nobody knew the real reason. Garrett spun it as my grief making me unsuitable for partnership. Some people believed him. Others heard Natalie's version through mutual friends. The company culture fractured over whose story to trust. 3 senior developers resigned in solidarity with me. Garrett's reputation took hits even among people who never learned the full truth. The medical board completed its investigation 4 months after Natalie's baby was born. A healthy boy delivered by C-section with no complications. The board found Lydia had violated numerous standards of care. Her certification was revoked. She was barred from practicing as a midwife in the state. Criminal charges were filed for practicing medicine without proper credentials. The district attorney built cases for manslaughter in 3 deaths, where clear evidence showed Lydia's negligence had directly caused fatality. The other families joined civil suits seeking damages. Garrett hired a defense team that cost more than his buyout to me. The trials took 18 months. Lydia was convicted on 2 manslaughter counts and sentenced to 8 years in prison. The civil suits awarded damages totaling $6 million across 7 families. Garrett's house was liquidated to pay. The company was seized as part of asset recovery since he'd used it to launder Lydia's income. Everything he'd built disappeared to pay for protecting his wife's body count. Natalie cut contact with her father completely. She'd given the medical board detailed testimony about Lydia's prenatal care and Garrett's knowledge of the risks. Her testimony was central to proving Garrett's complicity. The prosecutor considered charging him as an accessory, but determined the evidence was insufficient for criminal conviction. Civil liability was different. Natalie filed her own suit for emotional distress and reckless endangerment. She won a judgment for $500,000. Garrett declared bankruptcy after the verdicts. His assets were distributed among creditors. He moved into a rental apartment, lost his professional network, applied for jobs nobody would give him once they Googled his name. I heard he was working retail somewhere. Minimum wage at a hardware store. His LinkedIn still claimed he was a tech executive. The cognitive dissonance was complete. My wife and I used the buyout money to start a foundation funding midwife accountability and home birth safety standards. We partnered with medical schools to develop proper certification programs, lobbied for legislation requiring incident reporting, provided legal resources to families harmed by negligent practitioners. Our son's death became part of preventing others. Not through Garrett's empty promise that Lydia would improve, but through systematic reform that created real accountability. We had another child, 16 months after Natalie's son was born. Hospital delivery with an OB/GYN team we vetted thoroughly. A daughter who's now 6 months old, healthy and perfect. Her nursery is painted yellow where our son's was blue. We named her Hope because that's what survived the grief. The rage I'd felt has faded into something more productive. I still think about that moment in the cafe when I could have warned Natalie immediately. Part of me wanted Garrett to save her himself, to prove he could choose his daughter over protecting Lydia. He failed that test completely. But Natalie survived anyway, and her testimony put Lydia in prison where she couldn't hurt anyone else. Justice was slower than revenge, but more permanent. Garrett sent a letter last month. His attorney delivered it through the foundation's office. He said he was sorry, that he'd been wrong, that he'd let greed blind him to what Lydia was really doing, that he'd never forgive himself for risking Natalie's life, that our son deserved better than his dismissal of our grief. The words sounded genuine, but felt hollow. Sorry doesn't resurrect dead babies. Sorry doesn't give back the families he destroyed while protecting his wife. Sorry is just a word people say when consequences finally arrive. I didn't respond. Some apologies don't deserve acknowledgement. The foundation's work speaks louder than anything I could say to Garrett individually. We've helped pass legislation in 3 states, shut down 6 negligent practices, provided resources to 40 families seeking justice. That's the real response to men like Garrett who choose profit over human life. You build systems that make their complicity impossible. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.